This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 304, Voice Content and Usability in Drupal. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking with Preston So about voice content and usability in Drupal, as well as his book From a Book Apart, Voice Content and Usability. I'm John Picozzi, and joining me today for the second time on Talking Drupal is Preston So. Preston joined us in episode 242 to talk about Drush all the way back in April of 2020. Preston is a product architect and strategist, digital experience futurist, innovation lead, developer advocate, and three-time South by Southwest speaker, and an author. He has been a programmer since 1999, a web developer and designer since 2001, a creative professional since 2004, and a content architect since 2007. He's currently product leader at Oracle. Preston has led product design and engineering teams since 2015 at Acquia, Time Inc., and Gatsby. Preston is an editor at A List Apart, columnist at CMS Wire, a contributor to Smashing Magazine, and has delivered keynotes around the world in 3 languages. Preston is based in New York City, and when he can, he immerses himself in languages that are endangered or underserved. Preston, welcome to the show.
Hey, John. Thanks so much for having me back on Talking Drupal. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Yeah, Preston's just coming off of organizing Decoupled Days, right, online this year, which was great. I had a chance to attend that. So you can catch those videos. Will those videos be online at some point?
Well, we're an all-volunteer team, and we definitely have day jobs, and we definitely don't ever promise a date because it's a lot of work to get those videos done, but we will definitely have them up at some point, and really appreciate everyone's support.
They will be available in the future. Also joining us for the next 4 weeks is Aaron Winboard Award winner, Amy June Heinlein. Amy June is the community ambassador at Canopy Studios. She works in the Drupal contribution space as a mentor, initiative lead, and runs first-time contribution workshops at the local, regional, and national level. Amy June is also on the CWG community health team. If you want to know more about that, you can listen to, I believe it was 2 weeks ago's podcast. She has a magical life away from Drupal where she enjoys music festivals and gallivanting in the woods looking for lost treasure. That actually sounds super fun. We are going to have to dig into that over the next 4 weeks. Amy June, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
It is going to be an action-packed show today, but as we normally do, let's do check in with our hosts and see what's going on. Amy June, because you are the newcomer, we will start with you. What's going on this week with you?
Well, last week I visited WordCamp Santa Clarita, which was sort of nice. I work both in Drupal and WordPress, and it was really exciting and inspiring, this WordCamp, because they had a whole track both days dedicated to accessibility and inclusion. And I really liked that model. And those were the most visited talks too. So that was really nice. So I had the privilege of speaking on a subject that's near and dear to my heart on accessibility. And then I also volunteered, and I realized, like, when we volunteer at camps, how more integral we feel as part of the community, because we get to meet more people, like the speakers and the organizers. And I know people are always talking about this virtual camp fatigue they have. So I want to invite folks to like participate more, because it really adds to that experience. But getting away from WordPress, I'm actually planning a trip this week. I'm going to Asheville, North Carolina for some music, because I really like music. A variation of the Grateful Dead are playing, and then punk rock band Sleater-Kinney is touring, and they happen to coincide within a couple of days in Asheville. And we know that Asheville is really fun. So it's been quite an adventure this week planning my trip.
That sounds cool. So going back to the WordCamp for a second, you said that you volunteered. Was volunteering at a WordCamp different than volunteering at a Drupal camp, or was it like pretty much the same? You're just jumping in and helping where you can?
Pretty much the same. I usually take the same roles though, like host monitor or session monitoring at Drupal camps, and then they call it emceeing to make it like sound fancier at word camps. And that's the place I really like to be because I like to talk and be on camera. So those two positions really help, but it's not much different. I don't necessarily volunteer at the organizer level at word camps because I do it so much in Drupal that I just don't have the time. So
cool.
Yeah.
All right. So for me, this week, as our listeners know, if you've listened to the show for a while, I am not an avid reader, but I am working through a book right now by Daniel Pink called "To Sell Is Human." Happens to be a holdover from my previous job. So just thought it was interesting because in this book he's talking about Elijah Otis, who in 1853 produced the world's first elevator. I'm using air quotes for those people who can't see me. Elevator pitch. You may be familiar with the last name Otis as Otis Elevator Company. So back in that 1853, elevators were relatively unsafe because they didn't have safety mechanisms to prevent them if the cord was cut from plummeting down to the bottom of the shaft. Mr. Otis came in and created a system to prevent that. And to show that this would work and elevators were now safe, he went to a convention I believe in New York, and rented out the convention, a large spot on the convention floor, and built an elevator shaft three stories up, and had somebody lift him up to the top of it, took an axe and cut the rope, and everybody in the audience gasped, and he started to plummet, and his system went into effect, stopping him. And that was supposedly the first elevator that I thought it was a super interesting story. Like, you always wonder, like, elevator pitch, it's supposed to be the length of an elevator, but that Daniel Pink, To Sell Is Human. You can learn a lot of cool things from that book. So I'll let you know when I finish it. It's probably going to be a couple months. Nick, what's going on with you?
Not too much. We've been, I guess, just another weather update. We had some thunderstorms this weekend with hail and torrential downpour, but with all the rain, my trumpet vines are finally flowering for the first time that I planted last year. So this is probably, regular listeners, this is probably my 5th or 6th update, but one of them started producing tons of buds. So I'm looking forward to seeing if we get hummingbirds, and they grow a little bit faster than I expected too. So we have like an archway that I put up over the walkway up to the house, and twice a week now I need to kind of tie them up, or they end up hitting the mailman every day. These things grow like 3 or 4 inches a day when it rains, and then it's sunny the next day. It is kind of scary. So, I think I'm going to regret the choice.
So weather's kind of nutty because Nick lives like an hour and a half north of where I live, and literally it hasn't rained considerably here in like 2 weeks. And God. The other day I left the house and went like 10 minutes north, and it was like the ground was wet. It was raining, and I just can't catch rain to save my life. But anyway, there will probably, maybe Nick, you could put a picture of your trumpet vines in the newsletter. People might like to see the visual there. Preston, last but not least, what is going on with you?
Sure. Like Amy Chun, I'm very involved in working on community events and doing a lot of volunteering. And if you can see those who are watching the feed can see the bags under my eyes, I've had a very sleepless few nights last week organizing Decoupled Days, which is the only nonprofit headless CMS conference. We had our 5th year, which is kind of remarkable to think about the fact that we've been doing this for 5 years now, and it's still chugging along. Those who have been following Decoupled Days for a few years now know that we're very committed to diversity and inclusion, and really focusing on good representation amongst our speakers as well as amongst our organizers. So this year we definitely had a very ambitious goal that we did not meet And I think a lot of that comes from being a virtual conference again this year. And just, a lot of people, as Amy June mentioned, have that virtual camp fatigue. I certainly do. I can't wait to be back at in-person events. But we definitely did a lot of work on better inclusion in our organizing team, which is, overwhelmingly people of color. We have some really great representation now on our team. So really excited for next year. We'll see what happens. The other thing that I've got going on this week is just last week, I finished the final, or a couple weeks ago, actually, now I finished the final touches on those of you who know me have probably known me through my book that I wrote, Decoupled Drupal in Practice, a few years ago, which was, still actually one of the only books about creating decoupled Drupal implementations. So I just finished my third book now, which is Gatsby, the Definitive Guide, which is the comprehensive guide to working with Gatsby.js. So in addition to Voice Content and Usability that just came out a couple of weeks ago, I've got this book coming out this fall, working on another book actually that's going to be coming out next year. So a lot of stuff going on in terms of my writing. I've kept myself very busy, maybe a little too busy over the course of the past year and a half. So got a lot going on, but really excited to be on the show today.
Well, I look forward to seeing when those books come out. Make sure you let us know when they do, and we'll throw something in the newsletter for you, and maybe have you on to chat about them.
Just out of curiosity, Preston, are you self-publishing, or are those going through publishing houses?
Great question. So Decoupled Drupal in Practice went through Apress, which is published, pro Drupal development, very well known in the Drupal world. The Voice Content and Usability book that came out in June, that came out through a Book Apart, and very, very lucky to get to work with them. They're a joy of a team. And then this third book, Gatsby, the Definitive Guide, coming out probably in October at this rate, is from O'Reilly. So definitely doing a bit of a tour around publishers.
There you go.
And one thing I'll reveal for folks who are listening here is actually I'll be writing another book, the sequel to Voice Content and Usability, a bit of a spiritual sequel called Immersive Content and Usability, also with the Book Apart, and that's going to come out next year.
Awesome.
Very
You
cool.
heard it here first, folks. Moving into our module of the week.
Yeah, so the module of the week this week is Twig Suggest. So over the last, I don't know, what is it now, 5 years of Drupal 8, if you've done any theming whatsoever, you've become familiar with Twig and theme suggestions. And so, for example, if you've got debugging turned on, then it's very easy to look at something and say, hey, which template do I need to create to override this particular display? So it might be something like node, and then the content type, and then the display. But there's some gaps. There's some template suggestions that aren't in core. And so this module aims to kind of bridge that gap. So if you have a need to override a block in a particular region, some user level templates, container templates, certain field templates, then this module is the module for you. It kind of just bridges the gap a bit. And when you're doing like component-based theming, sometimes you just need to rip out some Drupal theming, and this module makes it easy to do.
So does it enhance core's debugging functionality, or is it? I mean, I'm assuming it's one of those things you would only use in development, but like, does it enhance that functionality, or is it like, could it be used on its own?
It doesn't really have anything to do with debugging other than displaying the suggestions, when you're inspecting. So it's really just a bunch of, it's either I think it's just a bunch of preprocessed hooks that are just adding the suggestions.
Got it.
So it's, it's dead simple. You could do it in your theme. And in fact, that's how I used to do it. I used to just add a preprocessed hook in the theme file when I need to add a template suggestion. But this makes the suggestions theme agnostic, and it just covers a much broader array of suggestions. Like you don't have to, figure out which one you have to create. Like they're just there.
Got it. All right. Well, that sounds pretty useful. Let's jump into our primary topic. So, Preston, talking about elevators at the beginning of the show, talking about voice content. Can you give us an overview or the elevator pitch for what is voice content and how does it impact usability?
Yeah, so voice content is a really interesting topic these days, and I'm very lucky and privileged to have written the first ever book on voice content. voice content is really focused around the notion of delivering the types of content that we currently have splayed across our browser viewports on websites and in content management systems like Drupal, and delivering that content to voice. One of the things that I think is really interesting about voice interfaces today, like Alexa or Google Home or Siri or Cortana, is that a lot of these interfaces focus primarily on transactions or performing tasks. They're not really focused on informational use cases, like answer questions for me or give me a sense of a topic, as opposed to book a flight for me or book a hotel room for me or book an Uber for me. And a lot of these use cases are really important these days as these voice interfaces become more commonplace. I think one of the things that's really interesting about voice interfaces right now is over the course of the past year and a half, because we've been so homebound, a lot of us have invested in smart speakers or smart home systems, or have invested in certain technologies that help assuage some of the boredom or ennui that we might be facing right now over the course of all these lockdowns that are happening. And of course, I want to hold space for everyone who is still dealing with the trauma and is still very much in the midst of all of the issues around the pandemic today. The notion of voice content, however, I think is really interesting because the ways that it impacts usability has to do not only with the notion of accelerating some of the delivery of content. You don't have to type in a URL into your browser window. You don't have to figure out how the information architecture of a website works. You can just ask questions or, get some information by talking with somebody that is a disembodied voice in a voice interface. But I think it's also very relevant for accessibility. And one of the most well-known advocates for voice interfaces in the blind community is Chris Maury, who's written about this in Wired Magazine, where one of the things that I think is very interesting is you hear from those who are blind users of websites that using a screen reader exacts a very heavy cognitive toll. It's something that is really challenging because you got to sift through all these announcements of links and media assets. You got to, figure out how to skip to main content where you have those sorts of scenarios. And the fact of the matter is that these websites and the content that we've written for these websites, by and large, is really focused around the visual underpinning of how we use that content. It's very much rooted in that visual sandbox that we play in, that visual context of nav bars and buttons and links, when for those who are using screen readers or really navigating using tools that are not visually rooted, it's a very, very severe challenge to be able to write content or structured content in a way that makes sense orally and not visually. So one of the things that I think is really interesting about Chris Maury's work is he's very focused on this notion of we can actually make voice interfaces that accelerate and make more efficient the interactions that we have with content by deploying them in the form of voice content through voice interfaces, as opposed to forcing so many of our users to go through a screen reader, which could be a much more cumbersome experience.
So I guess the thing that jumps into my mind here is how do you, I think that there's a gap because a lot of websites don't pay attention or don't pay close enough attention to accessibility, right? So the question is, how do you make people aware that a particular site is accessible in a new way? So it's not like, hey, our screen reader experience is going to be better, but we have a slightly different experience that will be better from the get-go. How do you even go about educating somebody that, hey, you can try this option, see if it works for you, when they might just be used to just using a screen reader and dealing with, an endless list of nested divs.
Yeah, it's a great question, Nick. And I'll go ahead and cite, of course, the sort of case study that undergirds my book, Voice Content and Usability, which you can get right now from abookapart.com. And one of the things that we discovered in working with a very well-known Drupal site, which is georgia.gov, is that oftentimes there's really two responses to your question, right? Which is that oftentimes it's not really a matter of serving existing website users, because one of the things that we discovered as we were doing a lot of our user analysis, our demographic analysis, is that a lot of folks were really falling through the cracks when it came to residents of Georgia who wanted to get information about state government. And one example of this is, think about all the elderly, the elderly Georgians who don't have a smartphone or don't have a computer at home, who might feel much more comfortable, as we found actually, interacting with a voice interface that's on their Alexa device that they might have on their couch, which is a much easier way of interacting with content than trying to figure out a nav bar and breadcrumbs might be. The other, of course, kind of demographic that's very important to consider is disabled folks, disabled Georgians who are unable to necessarily visit a agency office, for example. They might not necessarily want to use a screen reader, as we just discussed. And having these experiences actually opens up really interesting dimensionality for these users, in a sense that when you actually move away from the website as your core nexus of all of that content delivery, you're actually reaching users that you would never have even reached through that website by pure virtue of going through a very, very different mechanism of getting there. Now, for the discoverability of this, we did a couple of different things. Obviously, we made it available on the website as, this kind of messaging that said, hey, you can go to the Alexa Skills Marketplace, download this onto your Alexa device. And of course, anyone browsing the Alexa Skills Marketplace would also be able to find this as well. But we also did a big push to, really share the amazing work that we had done on this, and announced this far and wide. We announced this, of course, on Georgia.gov, in their blog. We announced this on, a variety of different press outlets. And it was a really big deal back then because it was really the first ever, not only the first ever voice interface built for residents of the state of Georgia, it was also one of the first ever voice interfaces that deployed content, or that was content driven. The overwhelming majority of voice interfaces today are still task driven or transactional, in that we're not so interested necessarily about booking something. We're more interested in actually finding out about, well, how do I renew my driver's license, or how do I register to vote, or how do I apply for a small business loan, which are all things that are very relevant to an audience that is wider, of course, than just the website audience.
I want to follow up with an accessibility question. What can we learn beyond, what can we learn about accessibility beyond content layout from how voice content works? Is there any other, like beyond the screen reader, what sort of accessibility can we learn?
Yeah, absolutely. This goes into really chapters 3 and 4 of my book. Chapter 4 in particular deals with information architecture and wayfinding in voice interfaces. And I think there's a couple of different things here that are very important to recognize. The first is that a website, because it's visually rooted, is necessarily something that is hub and spoke, it's networked, it's multifaceted, you've got all these different chunks on the page. But with a voice interface, you really have a very limited perspective. And I think this is relevant not only to those who are looking for an alternative to screen readers, who are focused on using pure voice interfaces as a means to access content more quickly, but also for those, for example, people with cognitive disabilities who might not necessarily have an interest in context switching as much as we often demand that users do on a website. For this reason, especially on a voice interface where you have not a notion of operating in space, you really have a notion of operating in time. And I think this is one of those really interesting differences between visual interfaces and voice or conversational interface, voice interfaces in particular, that is really interesting to those who are working in multimodal accessibility. Because when you look at voice interfaces, you're really talking about a linear flow, a linear architecture. And you can't just kind of present a massive sitemap or a massive drop-down menu that's completely unnavigable in even a screen reader, quite honestly, and expect for somebody who's on a voice interface to be able to somehow be able to navigate these menus in a way that makes sense to them. One of the things that I think is really great about the ways in which voice interfaces address some of these issues in the visual setting is they linearize all of this content disclosure. And what that means is that you're not revealing content in such a way where you're obligated to use these links, you're obligated to find these hidden nooks and crannies. You're actually really forced to put your content in a flow that is hierarchical, not in the sense of a structural hierarchy, but in the sense of what is going to be progressively more important to the user, like a funnel. And I think what that does is it really establishes a sense that the user is able to navigate through content that's very much organized around the ways in which they're going to use a voice interface. And one example of this is very crucial, and there's a metaphor I use extended in my book about what forestry professionals and forestry scientists use in terms of single access keys. Single access keys or dichotomous keys are essentially these mechanisms for identifying trees in the wild, but they always start from a single core root question. You never actually have this situation like on a website where you have 15 different links or 5 different menu items to choose from. You always start from the same starting point. And especially when it comes to an environment where you're operating in an oral space, an oral environment, and not operating in a visual setting, it's very important to have a linear, unidirectional, and also a very clear flow that is very, very different, I would say, and very, very different from the sorts of navigational hierarchies and information architecture that we find on a website.
Yeah, in my head right now, I'm like imagining like your website, your website sitemap where you're like, you throw in like 10 high level pages and like, hundreds of sub pages to a user, as opposed to like a very specific kind of like question tree, right? Where like the user's coming in, they're asking one question and then it's going down a path and figuring out what information they need. It's super interesting, right, to think about, because it's a more directed, or at least the impression I'm getting is it's a more directed way to get that user the content that they actually need, as opposed to having them have to hunt for it, right?
Sorry, I want to go back to your example that you mentioned about identifying trees. You said that there's a single key question that they ask when identifying trees.
Yeah.
What's the question?
Yeah. So generally speaking, when you are in and I have a friend who works for the Forest Service, and in high school biology, you usually learn about this sort of thing, which is really ironic because we don't really experience dichotomous keys or single access keys ever again in our lives when it comes to our day jobs. But the core question that is always asked is the tree basically a deciduous tree or is it a coniferous tree? In other words, does the tree's leaves, or are they broadleaf? Are they basically these beautiful, sort of like what you would find in a I'm really
like an oak tree.
There you go, like an oak tree. And I grew up in I'm from Colorado, so of course I'm much more used to the coniferous tree, which is more needles. And pines and spruces will display this trait. And that's the core, right? And this is the interesting thing, is that with Ask Georgia Gov, we had the same exact technique where you go into the Alexa skill, you say, Alexa, ask Georgia Gov, and the very first thing Alexa says is, well, hey, feel free to answer it, feel free to ask a question about Georgia. And that's your single prompt that is always the same prompt every single time. Not only does that foster that flow that I mentioned and that lack of, complete, let's say, decision fatigue or just kind of overwhelming sense of options in a sitemap that you find, it also really allows for what is known in voice interface usability circles as habitability, which is this notion of being able to, Rich Harris talks about this, for example, in his book, Voice Interaction Design, which is, hey, let's create an interface where somebody can come back and feel like they're back in a place that they can inhabit for a long time, which is a very core tenet of all user experience. And the ways in which we write these prompts, the ways in which we kick off these interactions are really very important to the way that we actually perceive the voice interface as something that works well for us from a user experience and from an accessibility standpoint. Because starting with that same question and going down the same series of questions and going down the same lines of questioning facilitates also the learnability of that interface. And anytime I come back, just like a dichotomous key or a single access key, I've notched another, interaction with that interface, and I know exactly how it's going to work the next time. And that actually serves to accelerate my interactions in the future as well, in much the same ways that understanding, for example, the sitemap or an information architecture of a website can do the same for those who are working in a browser.
So when you're thinking about designing, so when I'm thinking about this, it sounds like you're simultaneously making the hierarchy of the site flat so that people can kind of enter at any point, but you're normalizing it with this dichotomous key. So people can always enter in the same place, but where they go depends on kind of the context of that question. So when you're designing a voice interface, how do you go about determining where those branch points are at that first level? I mean, obviously there's a lot of user research, but it sounds, I imagine that the process is very different than building, an information architecture for, for a web interface versus a voice interface.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and you really nailed it there when you said it's not an easy question to answer. I mean, it really, the answer is a lot of these things, as we know, is it depends, right? The very first thing you got to do is figure out what your audience looks like. You got to figure out what it is that they're looking for, and this can't just happen through looking at the website, right? Because as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the things that we do on websites are things that are really focused around that tunnel vision, that one-dimensional perspective that we often have of website users. But as we know, so many people are slipping through the cracks. So many of those who are members of disabled communities, so many of those who are elderly are not using the website in the same way as the vast majority of website users do. So really understanding your demographics is a very important first step. Now, the most kind of, it really depends on the content too, right? Because for Ask Georgia Gov, the content that we were dealing with was frequently asked questions content or Q&A content that was displayed on the website. But if you're dealing with types of content that are more involved in progressive disclosure, where you're not actually doing something like a question and answer machine, you're actually doing something that's a little bit different, that really changes the way that you approach this whole discussion as well. You're probably going to be designing that much more in a catered format than you would with a voice interface where you start with a top-level search, for example. So for Ask Georgia Gov, we really started with a top-level search, right? Because that's really what a question and answer machine is all about, is any conceivable question about a topic, you want to be able to answer it, but you also don't want to narrow the pathways that users can go down too quickly. So it's one of those things that really straddles a lot of different problem spaces. You really have to think about your audience, got to think about your content strategy. You got to think about who your, obviously do a lot of user research. And what we found is that this actually proved our approach, right? Because one of the things that we found in our later work is that those users who were navigating on the website were conducting very different searches and accessing very different content from the kinds of content that people were accessing through the voice interface. And that's a very, very clear sign that the ways in which people are navigating your website are usually very different from the ways in which people want to navigate other interfaces, not only for reasons of accessibility or serving, those different demographics, but also because of the fact that it's a different dimension of operating in content as well. So those top level items, it really depends, right? Like the first could, if you're doing a FAQ or Q&A type of interface, you really want to limit it to kind of a top level search and then winnow down and use that as your filtering mechanism. If you're working on content that's kind of, you've already got a well-established sense of your content hierarchy, and it's really just about kind of doing a choose your own adventure type thing where you're basically navigating content that's already established in a clear hierarchy. And you want to be very careful about how you want to organize that. And that might bear some relation to the information architecture on your website, but might not as well.
In thinking of, how you design your voice interface and the questions that you ask, is the system, is the voice system learning and retaining the interactions that it's having with a user? And, if it is, how can that impact voice content?
Yeah. I think this really digs into the realm of privacy on voice interfaces and obviously regulatory compliance. One of the things that I think is very challenging about voice interfaces is we all probably heard back in the day about some of the issues that surfaced around Amazon Alexa or Google Home or some of these smart speakers eavesdropping on the conversations that we were having in the privacy of our own homes. And this is, of course, one of the big reasons why a lot of people, especially those of us in the technology world, don't actually have these devices at home. I use the one at my mom's, for example. I don't use any voice interface here purely for those privacy reasons. Now, there is obviously a wide variety of approaches you can take where you can retain information, save user history. All of these ecosystems in Alexa, Google Home have those capabilities, obviously. And now with the new Siri development kit, you can also do those things. But the big question is, well, is that really what your users want? And is that also, how much additional value does that give to the user who's going to be working in your user interface, as opposed to not preserving those interactions? We made a very, very early decision with Ask Georgia Gov not to save those details and not to retain any information, because that's simply a big can of worms. I mean, especially with state government, especially with a lot of the reluctance to have governments tracking information, or, you know, having a sense of who these people are who are accessing this content and personally identifiable information. It's really a tough kind of walkway to be navigating. And there's been a lot of discussion recently about Alexa and voice interfaces and the privacy implications of voice interfaces. I think one of the things you really have to think about is, well, if you're going to build in, let's say, and this goes into some of the implementation details, but if you go into some of these realms where you're going to be saving and preserving your history of the interactions that you had, email addresses, some of the responses you gave, what does that do for those who are operating in the EU around GDPR? What does that do around things like HIPAA compliance, where you might potentially be dealing with, let's say, a healthcare-related Alexa skill or a healthcare-related Google Home device, and you might be preserving this information? Does that violate any of these regulatory issues? Does this put into question any of these regulatory issues that could surface? There's been some really good information that's come out recently about privacy and voice interfaces. We haven't heard the end of it, obviously, but for Ask Georgia Gov, I mean, one of the reasons we didn't go down that route of preserving some of this information is that a lot of those sorts of transactions, and this is where we get into some of the interesting ways in which the implementation overlaps with the content and overlaps with the design of your user experience. One of the things that we found with Ask Georgia Gov is that, well, the Georgia.gov website, its purview and its jurisdiction is merely about serving information. If you want to renew your driver's license or register to vote, you're going to go over to the Department of Driver Services website, or you're going to go over to the Board of Elections website, right? You're not going to be doing those sorts of tasks on the Georgia.gov website. And given that our entire focus was limited to the Georgia.gov website, we really decided at that very beginning stage of the project to say, well, it doesn't really make a lot of sense for us to do that, because it might require us to expand our scope out to some of these other properties of state government websites that we really don't have control over, and also might have their own ideas about how to serve voice users instead. And this really gets into some of the challenges that we face. Yeah, people might want to be able to say, hey, register me to vote. You know, let me renew my driver's license by talking with Alexa. But I think the privacy concerns are there. And also, of course, there's the artificial concern of the fact that you can't really wash away those lines in the sand as easily as you might on a website.
I want to circle back to accessibility real quick, Preston. With the new WCAG 3.0 guidelines, with WCAG meaning Web Content Accessibility Guidelines for folks who don't know. So the new success criteria is on the horizon, where cognitive disabilities are addressed almost exclusively. So readability becomes super important. Do you have any suggestions for maintaining or building content?
Definitely a great question. I think you know, as somebody who has worked in a lot of different kinds of content, it's definitely a very important question. This, I think, though, really focuses on some of the ways in which web content operates, which is very different, obviously, from the way voice content operates. If you are, as I mentioned in chapter 2 of my book, Voice Content and Usability, if you are going to be doing something where you're reusing content across web and voice, it's a very interesting balancing act between obviously the readability of content on a website, which has massive implications for those who need to be able to read content. It also has implications, though, on what I call the oral or voice legibility of content, which is also a very different kind of thing and has its own implications for cognitive disabilities as well. So it's a really interesting problem, because I think a lot of times we write content thinking that it's just going to be for the website, but we're not necessarily thinking about some of the ways in which multimodal accessibility and the fact of users now reaching for many different kinds of devices is now impacting the ways in which that content needs to be legible. However, I think that a lot of those same principles apply. And when it comes to the success criteria in the WCAG 3.0, a lot of those recommendations very much apply in the same exact ways to voice content, because the sorts of things, even though we have this very, very wide gulf between written content and spoken content, the ways in which that content is transmitted is fundamentally rooted at the textual level. That being said, I do think it is important to recognize that separation between the ways in which we listen to content and the ways in which we read content, because the two, especially for those who are members of disabled communities, could not be further from each other in many regards. One very good example of this, for instance, is that voice interfaces, for instance, cannot be used by members of the deaf community or members of the blind deaf community, or the deaf-blind community. There's absolutely no way to actually create a voice interface that can serve everybody. And so people who see that as kind of like a Band-Aid on top of your accessibility issues are really barking up the wrong tree. And this really, and I know I'm going in a little bit of a different direction here, but this is not in any way to kind of suggest that, the WCAG is too focused. But I think one of the things that I would love to see begin to happen in the industry at large is, what are some of the things that we need to think about in terms of multimodal content accessibility, especially given that so many organizations today do not have the luxury, like the state of Georgia, for example. They do not have the luxury to write two separate versions of content, one that's really oriented towards those disabled audiences in the website, especially adhering to those success criteria, but also having to serve the voice audience. And it's a really pernicious problem, because this gets into a lot of those weird tensions and frictions, I think, between the facts of life and lived experiences that we all have. Frankly, somebody who's using a website with certain disabilities is not going to have the same experience as those with others on a voice interface. And I think it's really tough to pigeonhole ourselves into a single channel and assume that, we can resolve. And this is one of the biggest kind of pits I see a lot of organizations fall into, is if we adhere to WCAG for everything, that's great. But as soon as we start going into these other realms, as soon as we start examining, like, what could our digital signage content look like? What could our augmented reality content look like? What could our wearable content look like? What could our voice content look like? Suddenly, it's a little bit of unmapped territory. And I think it's a really interesting next step for a lot of us who are interested in accessibility.
So that actually kind of dovetails with my next question, which is around, for lack of a better word, bad voice content. We've all had interactions with, before we had smart devices in our homes, picking up the phone and calling somebody and going through a phone tree, right? My question is around, negative interactions or bad voice content that leads to a negative experience. And, how does bad voice content affect, impact experience, and how do you learn from that?
Yeah, there's several pieces to that I think that are really important to suss out. The first, I think, is a little bit more deeply rooted, which is that voice content becomes an inherently challenging endeavor, because unlike websites, for the most part, Clippy notwithstanding, Ask Jeeves notwithstanding, we're not really attaching a personality or attaching a human identity to our interfaces that are visual. Like, we're not necessarily using Georgia.gov, the Georgia.gov website, thinking that it's a person that we're interacting with, even though we know, of course, that there are people behind the scenes who are making all of this work. But voice interfaces are different. And Erica Hall writes in Conversational Design that conversation is not a new interface. Conversation is the oldest interface, and nothing could be more true. If you think about writing developed in a very, very, very recent time period as opposed to human speech. Because of the ways in which we perceive human speech and the psychology of how all of those things happen, we necessarily attach an identity to some of these voice interfaces that we interact with. And that identity, for better or worse, is largely a cisgender, white women who speaks in a general American or middle American dialect. If you look at Siri, if you look at Cortana, all those default settings are very much rooted in that kind of identity. And one of the big questions is, well, bad voice content, especially when you think about this added dimension of personality and human identity, bad voice content can mean very different things to very different people. And if you think about the lived experiences of some of the users of voice interfaces, if you think about, for example, Black and Indigenous people who are having to interact with not somebody who sounds like a member of their own communities, but somebody who is for all intents and purposes, a white woman in this context. Or if you think about the fact that oftentimes these biases that we have and these systems of oppression that we have infiltrate our interactions with voice interfaces. There is a reason why Alexa sounds the way she does, and why Siri sounds the way she does, and Cortana sounds the way she does. And that's because we have understood, as part of this internalized sense of what a voice interface should be, that by and large, they're secretarial women, they're executive assistants. And given the fact that so many of the people who wrote the very first ever voice interfaces and programmed them were generally cisgender, straight, white men, you see exactly how this manifests. And there's a very interesting idea that's come about in the realm of futurism, which is what's called the conversational singularity. Mark Curtis writes about this notion that just like the conversation we're having right now on this call, as soon as there will be a point in the future where the conversations we can have with Alexa and Cortana and Siri will be indistinguishable from our conversation right now. But the big question is that conversational singularity, who is that for exactly? Because I think that really digs at some of the problems that a lot of us in the technology industry face when it comes to automated racism, algorithmic oppression, and voice interfaces really reflect that. And I know I'm getting very, very far away from the original question here in this regard, but bad voice content is not only an issue of content strategy and writing legible and discoverable and well-structured voice content that's linear, and is also amenable to that sort of progressive disclosure. It's also a notion of how do we cater best to the lived experiences of those who are multiply marginalized, and also, of course, how do we think about the socioeconomic impact of the fact that so many of the people that are being replaced and substituted by these voice interfaces are by and large non-native English speakers, are by and large lower or middle income residents of countries where they're located in the global south. And what happens to that diversity of voices and that richness of human language that we lose when we establish this monoculture of this personality and this identity that we see in voice interfaces? It's a very interesting, but also a very pressing question.
So I feel like this, I feel like this needs its own show, to be honest, that this is opening up a whole branch of questioning that I don't think we have time for in the last 5 or 10 minutes of the show. So
it's literally so many more layers for that question and for this topic.
So just really briefly, because I know we're getting up on time. Can you tie this back to Drupal, since this is a Drupal show, and where does this content live when somebody's building a voice content interface? Or is it completely separate from Drupal?
It depends, right? So so the way to connect this back to Drupal. So here's the really nice thing. I'll share some, and you can find out more information about this at my blog Preston So, where I write about this project and its architecture. But this is really the first example of a live production project that involved the use of Drupal as a decoupled or headless CMS that serves content out to a voice interface. And what we did is we used the Alexa module, which was developed by my former colleague Jacob Suchi at Acquia. Chris Hamper at Acquia Labs was the person who really created the Drupal 7 version, has maintained it over the course of many years. And we use the Alexa module as the conduit through which to deliver all this content. The Alexa module basically establishes an integration with the Alexa development interface within the Amazon ecosystem. And what we did is we would basically allow for people to use the Alexa interface to conduct searches on the Drupal site. none of the content was actually housed separately from the Drupal site, because the Georgia team came to us with this very strict requirement. We need to be able to administer all this content and see all this content, preview all this content, see the analytics and the reports for all this content and the metrics for all this content in one single place. It's state government, so it's very limited in terms of budgets. And what we fostered was this environment where they could see side by side how their web content and their voice content performed in terms of the searches that were conducted, in terms of what pages people navigated to the most. And all of that content was then delivered out either through Drupal itself into the Georgia.gov website or through the Alexa module out to an API that Alexa could then consume. Very interesting architecture. I think it really is the approach that most people have taken with that sort of connectivity. And I think it's very instructive for a lot of those in the Drupal community. Now, I can't speak to the current state of the Alexa module. It's been a little while since I've touched it, but certainly there are others that are out there that folks are using these days to power these voice interfaces.
That's really interesting. It's just really complex, like Nick was saying. We've mentioned your book. Can you quickly share with us the origin story of your book?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so the biggest thing that happened is, I had a chance meeting last year with some of the folks in the A Book Apart team. And, what had happened was oftentimes I think that there's a little bit of a delay between getting to the point where you have enough eyes on something as a trend to get enough interest in it to justify a book or justify a talk or justify something of that nature. Several folks on the A Book Apart team and an Event Apart team discovered my talk at Front End United a few years ago about this project and about essentially transforming web content into voice content. And they got in touch and they said, hey, how would you like to work with us on some of these really amazing assets that we want to work on around voice? And I'm very lucky that I already had a bit of an idea for this book. I had been rejected actually in the past by A List Apart and by some of these folks, so it was a really interesting kind of circle back around. And the rest, as they say, is history. I mean, got the book proposal together very quickly, as it was already something that was in progress. And now it's been a really interesting journey to see the book come to life. And it's been an honor and a privilege to work on something that has already been such an inspiration for so many people.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to us on Twitter at Talking Drupal or in the Talking Drupal channel on Drupal Slack. You can email us at show@talkingdrupal.com. If you'd like to get updates, you can do that by signing up for our newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
You can also promote your Drupal camp on Talking Drupal. And you can learn more about this at talkingdrupal.com/camp promo.
Thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing Become a Patron. We've reached the end of our show. It's been an action-packed show, and we appreciate Preston's time. If somebody wanted to get a hold of you, Nick, how would they go about doing that?
You can reach me online pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
Amy June, what about you?
Volkswagen Chick across all the media, and I'm going to spell that because it's a German word, VOLKSWGENCHICK.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks at John Picozzi, as well as Drupal.org. And if you want to learn more about EPAM, you can find out about that at epam.com. So Preston, the link to your book we'll put in the show notes. If folks wanted to get in contact with you to talk about voice content, usability, Drupal, all the things, how would they go about doing that?
I do a lot of writing on my blog, Preston.so. You can also use the contact form there, Preston.so/contact. If you're interested in voice, its implications on accessibility, content strategy. If you're interested in CMS as well, I do a lot of writing on those topics on my blog. You can also reach me at Preston.so@oracle.com, where I currently am a product strategist. And you can also get in touch with me on social media. You can reach me on LinkedIn at Preston So and also on Twitter at Preston So. And by the way, if you want to check out my book, it's at abookapart.com, Voice Content and Usability, just launched last month. And if you want to learn more about me and about my endeavors and about what I'm up to, please feel free to visit preston.so, my website.
If you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. See you guys next week.
Have a good one.